Hello and welcome to yet another coronavirus webinar here from ITS UK. Just a reminder, if you haven't already, to follow us on YouTube for not only these sorts of webinars, but all our forum meetings as well. And when we started this off, we thought that we might have a series lasting 3 or 4 weeks until the world started to get back to normal. And now, 3 and a bit months later, we're still talking about the impact of coronavirus on transport in the UK and around the world. But we think this is a good point to take stock for a while as we look to at least the next lifting of lockdown and just have a look back at what we've learnt over the last few weeks, and then take a break, and we'll look to come back with some more discussions later on in the year as we see how the land lies. So what I decided to do was speak to 3 people who've been on previous editions of this programme, and one of them who was on the very first. So I'm pleased to welcome along Jenny Martin, who is Secretary General of ITS UK, Carla Jakeman, who's Innovation Lead Connected Transport at Innovate UK and is ITS UK's Vice Chair, and Nick Illsley, who's a former CEO of Transport Direct and a long-time rail executive, who was on the very first of our discussion programs back in March or early April, I think it was. And Nick, it seems so long ago. And when we spoke then, if I'd said to you that government advice, or in fact government ruling, would be that people should choose to use their car rather than take the train whenever possible, would you have believed me? Would you have ever believed that our transport policy could have led to such a reversal in all the things you worked on in all the years you worked in the industry?
Good question, Paul. I think had you looked at the evidence that was emerging even then, the answer probably should have been yes, although it probably would have been no. If you looked at all the requirements of social distancing, things like how one gets on and off a train, how you get your tickets, the narrow entrance and exit from most public transport modes, it was going to be very hard to social distance and use public transport. I also think, Paul, the other thing which has taken us all by surprise is how compliant people have been in the not getting close to other people, but how damaging that is for transport policy and around, including, don't forget, several people in your car. So it's not just public transport. Now, I know, and Jenny and Carla will know, that the average occupancy of a car is only just over 1, but actually even things like lift sharing, car sharing, being kiss and ride, as they call dropping people off at the station, they're all really difficult with social distancing. And I think the thing that we probably didn't acknowledge was the psychological effect of the virus and of the need to actually safeguard your own space and what that would mean for getting around. So we ought to have said, yes, that's an obvious consequence. And I think, Paul, we did talk about there might be reluctant to use public transport actually in our very first one, but I don't think we got it to the level where public transport's still running about 10 or 15% of demand, and cars is up to almost 100 and cycling's up to 200, but probably should have done.
But the interesting thing is, you talked about social distancing there, that will have, of course, changed people's attitude to public transport. Now, when you look at the Premier League in big empty stadiums on the television, and then the rerun of Glastonbury and so forth that was on last weekend, you think to yourself that some point in the future we are going to surely get back to no social distancing at all. It just seems that whether it's that we've got herd immunity, or there's just the decision that certain people keep away, or that we have a vaccine, or some way of getting back to normality. But I think one of the surprises that has come out of this crisis is how much businesses have actually, first of all, embraced and now welcome and a long-term planning for home working. So
Yeah.
that's going to completely change the demand on commuting, which of course will have a big impact on the rail industry.
Correct. Um, just to show how old I am, in 1976, when I joined the railways, I was actually told that we wouldn't need to worry about commuting for very long because people would work from home, and so the commuting peak would disappear fairly quickly. Interesting that 44 years later, it's taken a virus for much of that to happen. I tend to agree with you, though, Paul, that an element of working from home will become the new normal. And like you, I hate that term, but the new normal will include more working from home. It will become more acceptable, I think, mixed with some working in offices and some working in teams and getting together physically, because the benefits of actually seeing somebody and talking to somebody face to face, I think, are still there, and we shouldn't forget that some of that will come back. However, I suspect the peak of commuting and the peak of people using public transport and the roads for that matter around 9 in the morning may actually never get back to the same level.
And Jenny, I suppose this has been the point where here at ITS UK, we've been able to look at all the different projects that we've seen come to fruition over the years. And you've been involved in ITS UK since the 90s, and I as a member started going to meetings in the year 2000. So we've been around for quite a long time now. I think it's been quite a proud moment in amongst all the anxiety and the disruption of the virus hitting the country, that transport technology has really come into its own.
Yes, I agree with you, Paul. As you and Nick were saying, we couldn't have foreseen in the middle of March what would actually then happen. So it's been a lot of reacting to things that we had no sensible way of foretelling. But I feel that we have reacted really well. I mean, ITS UK as an organisation is functioning pretty well as normal, if you call what we're in now normal circumstances. And it's been great to see all the members, both large and small, private sector, public sector, all adapting really quickly and still delivering the services that they are duty bound to provide, whether that's as suppliers or whether it's as actual network operators. I think one of the things we learned from this is that it's quite incredible how much we can change when we really have to. And I've been looking back at being based in London, both working and living during the 2012 Olympics, and how much we changed then and how we then snapped back to the old normal, sadly, very quickly, and particularly things like peak time travel, it came back within the blink of an eye afterwards. I like to think that now we have been in this situation for so long, and we have the, depending on your personality and your medical circumstances, but we have greater or lesser fear of being infected still hanging over us. And I like to think that we will actually see, as we gradually move out of lockdown, we will see some lasting changes, and there'll be changes for the better.
And how do you think with the technology we have been seeing created and shared over the years, and a lot of the clever ideas that we see that never actually seem to be implemented, but they made great PowerPoint presentations, how do you see us being able to deliver for the travelling public in comparison to maybe the knee-jerk reaction of completely refitting the inside of trains or just changing bus routes, or as we've seen at the moment, the temporary, albeit temporary, but potentially long-term changes to road layouts to widen for social distancing with walking and cycling?
I think this is where we have the opportunity of really building on all the great work of the last few years on data. Because the thing is that we have so much data now, and we've been saying that for many years, but we are now in a situation where we have data which is of good quality and quite easily reusable. So we can get information out there about absolutely anything people want to underpin any choices they want to make. So if you want to know when the train is half empty, so you'd feel more safe going on it, we can tell you. If you want to travel on the roads at the less congested time, we can tell you. If you want to create as little air pollution as possible, we can tell you how. Just including not just congestion, but also weather data, for instance, if people are thinking about a car journey they might want to make. So we can really enable those smart choices for individual travelers, but we can also offer technology to operators, things like demand-led pricing on buses. In London, the bus fare is always £1.50. There's no technical reason why it has to be that. It can be a fiver when the bus is very full, and it can be 50p when it's very empty. There's no end to what we can do now, and I certainly sense from the key organisation in this country, like the Department for Transport, Highways England, I sense a real appetite for harnessing technology and all this fantastic data we have now to make actually not think the unthinkable, because we have been made to think the unthinkable already. We've been through that. That's happened, and now actually take it forward into something better.
So you mentioned where the government's looking at this. So let's actually talk to Carla Jakeman from Innovate UK, because of course, one of the things that hasn't fully hit following the lockdown is quite what the economy is going to look like in the future. And the government is borrowing a lot of money, it's printing money, and it potentially will have to tax us more in the future in order to pay back what has been spent in order to try and keep people solvent during this time. But it becomes, I suppose, Carla, a real responsibility on you to spend the money wisely that you have in grants, not only to make sure that jobs are supported and potentially created, but that the money that you're spending will pay back in multiples, because that's how we're going to pay the debt off, by the growth from investing a small amount and turning it into a bigger amount.
Yes, absolutely. So we're trying very hard to use innovation to support our route out of this situation with regards to economic impact, societal impact, environmental impact, so not just the financial side. And when we are running emergency competitions that we have done recently, we're very much hammering that home with the assessors that we're really looking for innovations that are going to help us move forward and get out of this crisis in a sensible way that's efficient, that really gets best bang for buck and makes the best use of that public money that's been spent on it to really look for those good innovations. So it's something we're doing and also to avoid duplication. We don't want to run several projects which are doing the same thing. So we are trying to take that portfolio approach.
And I was talking to a friend of mine who's trying to put together a business that he wants to get investors for. And one of the things he's planning to do is to make sure that the percentage that is British owned is always, as written in the Articles of Association, more than 50%, because he says that's the only way we can guarantee that the intellectual property remains in Britain, and we don't get what often happens with companies that then will get bought by Google, or they'll get bought by maybe a Chinese company or something, and all that hard work and innovation is suddenly owned by people in a different country. How important is it to consider that the work that we're investing in, the ideas we're investing in, remain within the country? Obviously you can export them, but the actual ownership remains here in the UK.
Yeah, we have quite strict rules on that actually, and depending on the nature of the competition. So if it's, for example, an SBRI, which stands for Small Business Research Initiative, then for those types of competitions, they have to be open to EU, EA, but for countries that are outside of that region, they need to have some kind of contingent which is within that region to make sure that it stays as close to home as possible. Now that's before we actually leave the EU, so what will happen after, we don't yet know, but certainly as the rule stands at the moment, that would be the case for an SBRI, and most of our competitions have some kind of stipulation, but we also run international competitions as well, and look for those partnerships, because it could be that the solution we need is actually in another country that we need to repurpose for the UK. So there's lots of different ways you can spin that one.
And Jenny, talking of internationally, one of the interesting things that ITS UK has been involved in over the last few weeks is working on more collaboration with the other national ITS organisations across Europe and beyond. It's something that I guess we as a solutions provider as an industry can do far better than people that are looking at digging up roads, building new rail lines and so forth. The expertise and the technology can be shared much more quickly and adapted for the UK.
Yes, I think that's an important part of what we do. I mean, I'm sure there are other organisations also making sure that the civil engineering experts exchange best practice. After all, digging in clay is the same whether you do it in Hanover or you do it in the Thames estuary. But in terms of technology, yes, I mean, as you know, ITS is a highly standardised sector. A lot of British experts working in standards. And that work is important. It means that our products can be used wherever we wish to sell them, and it also means that we can benefit from foreign expertise when we need it. So I think that work has been important for many years. It's becoming steadily more important, and I do think that it's a positive spin-off of our experience over the last 3 months, that doing an international collaboration used to perhaps feel a bit more onerous, because you'd feel you'd need to meet up physically at least a few times and shake hands and sit around the table together. Now I think a lot of us are feeling that actually you don't need to do that. You can meet like we are meeting now, and you can build your trust and you can build your bonds, and it actually works just as well. So I see a boom in these sorts of international collaborations and knowledge exchanges going forward.
Nick, talking of technology, you finished your career running Transport Direct, which many have said was ahead of its time. And of course, it got closed down several, I've run out of, can't remember, 5-6 years ago now. And actually, I keep thinking about it, that it would have been the absolute perfect platform for right now, because what Jenny mentioned about loading on particular trains, that could have been included. You could put in weather related stuff, so you know how many people are likely to be cycling, because we've seen the correlation between quality of weather and number of people cycling. Has it frustrated you that the solution you and your team spent so long and worked so hard on delivering isn't there when it probably would have really come into its own?
I think that's a slightly loaded question, my friend. 6 years ago, Paul, is the answer, 2014. Jenny will probably smile at this. Chris Gibbard rang me last week to tell me it's 20 years since Transport Direct was first mentioned in a public document by the Labour government of the day, which was in July 2000. However, the important thing I think that we did with Transport Direct wasn't the end service to customers, it was the organisation of the data that supported it and the stakeholders. To support Jenny, I totally think that our contribution needs to be the digital services and the information to both suppliers and users to make better decisions that actually we, via TD and Travelline and Highways England, probably became world leaders in the early 21st century, and probably still just about there-ish. But importantly, Paul, I think, to link it back to the reasons people travel, not the travel itself. So one of my slight frustrations with the response I've seen in many places is we're still talking about the mode of transport, and is it trains, is it cars, is it buses? We're not talking about how commuting works, how town centres work. You know, if there's a sector that's in grave trouble, it's the high street and town centres, and yet high street and transport systems are almost totally separate and divorced, and people don't equate access with town centre attractiveness and viability, which just defeats me. Ditto, I think, emissions and environment, and ditto employment. And if we get back to transport's an enabler and get away from it's a train, it's a bus, I think, and we add to that data and digital, we ought to be able to make a huge contribution to the future of whatever normal turns out to be. And finally, Paul, can I just thank you for terminating my career in 2014? That's very kind of you.
Oh, okay. I did actually, as I said that, Nick, think to myself, apart from the vast amount of consultancy work that he does
right.
now, but your let's face that your rail stroke civil service career. So
Yes.
we shall, you know, if this were a podcast and an audio, I would go back and re-record my question. You can't do that quite as easily on
Excellent.
Zoom, but
Good.
thanks for making my inability to come out with questions properly, particularly highlighted in the last of these ones, Nick. I've managed to blag my way through for 13 weeks, so I've been caught out just about in the end. You mentioned about the data, and one of the projects that we at ITS UK have been involved in over the weeks was working with DfT to get that data from local authorities, which again, we talk about things. I was working on the travel information highway 20 years ago. It was one of the things I got involved in through one of my very first ITS UK meetings when I came into the industry in 2000. And it's very frustrating that it's taken this crisis for us to then start sharing data properly. So I think what I'd like to start wrapping up this conversation is, if it's possible to say, what are the good things that have come out of coronavirus? I mean, it sounds like the sort of thing that radio phone-ins have. Well, I once heard somebody have a phone-in on the lighter side of football violence, and you think, what? So, but we'll try the advantages or the good things that have come out of coronavirus when it comes to transport and transport technology. Let's just go around the three of you and just let's look at some positives and where we're going to take that into the future.
If I start, I think the biggest bonus is possibly the effect on emissions and emission levels, which we've seen during this period. And going back to a point I think Jenny made, but it might have been Carla, in 2012, we saw what could be done with travel demand management and then threw it all away, as incidentally predicted by Peter Hendy, who said, we've done it for 7 weeks, doing it day in, day out is going to be much harder and we probably won't be able to do it. So I would like to see us look at what works in environmental terms, how we measure, including things like low-cost sensors, and how we can actually make proper reductions in emissions on a day-to-day basis, not in a lockdown basis. And I think that could be the biggest thing that comes out of coronavirus, for not for the transport industry, actually for communities and health and well-being.
Yes, so it's already been mentioned quite a lot about the data side of it, but I would definitely say that if there is such a thing as a winner from this pandemic, that data is definitely it, in that we can use it to see how people have travelled, where people have travelled, when they've travelled, to make sure that policy was correct, to help it shape policy, and to really help us understand the impacts of different policies and whether people are socially distancing and what will trigger different behaviour patterns. And I think also the innovation side of it. So we have really seen a big push in repurposing existing innovations, which I think has been really useful. So we've had existing projects where people have said, actually, I could probably use this product to get essential products to the elderly or people shielding and that kind of thing. So we've seen a lot of repurposing of existing innovations as well as new innovations. I think that's particularly it's been very useful.
I mean, I agree with everything that Nick and Carl have said. I think what we obviously what we want to do going forward is we want to lock in the environmental gains. We want to lock in the reductions in congestion. And I think what I don't think anyone has mentioned is we want to lock in the increase in active travel. I think cycling, particularly in this country, has, well, in the latest cycling boom, which I would describe the last 10 years as, nothing at all comparable to the Netherlands or Denmark, which are the comparisons usually quoted. The demographic cycling here, as a rule, very, very narrow. Very male, very professional, and very much in their 30s. And what we've seen over these last few months is something a lot more like Denmark or the Netherlands, where of wide demographic cycles, which actually makes it a lot more pleasant for a lot of people. So we want to lock that in as well. And I agree with the previous speakers that the role of transport technology is to enable this and to support it. And I think we are in a situation where we can do it. But it's all about the good outcomes for society, for the communities. And also, many of us are very worried about the state of the economy. Obviously, we're building up a very large deficit, which those of us who are paying tax are going to have to pay back. There's no question about that. But I think, again, what we can contribute to is to a new economy. We can't get the old economy back, and I don't think we necessarily want to. I think we're on the cusp of really big changes in who uses city centres, for instance, and what they're used for. And yes, there will be losers. If you're invested in office buildings, for instance, at the moment, probably your future doesn't look that great. But there will also be new opportunities in the suburbs. There was a great article in the Observer on Sunday exactly about that, about how this, if professional people start working from home as a norm, that's a big boost to suburban economies and big opportunities for a lot of people there. So the role of us in transport technology is to support and enable all these things. And if this had to happen, then it's good that it happened now. I said that in my previous webinar. If it had happened in 2010, we would have been absolutely at a loss. But it happened in 2020, and we are ready to deal with it.
So finally, very quickly, about 3 or 4 weeks into the crisis, I took a phone call from somebody at Radio 4, because one of my roles in ITS UK is to find experts for the mainstream media to be able to interview that helps promote transport technology. And I was asked what transport was going to look like in the future. And I said, if you get any guest that's going to tell you what that is, then they're lying. They haven't got a clue. Don't even bother talking to them. I'm now going to say several weeks later, I'm going to actually ask that question of you to see if we have a final idea of what things are going to be like next year and in 5 years' time when it comes to transport. So very briefly, each of you give me one way that transport is going to be significantly different in the future, down to the fact of what we've dealt with over the last few weeks.
I'm going to go for far better in terms of user choice and hopefully user payment. One of the things we haven't talked about is how poor the methods of payment for transport have proved to be in this crisis. So one of the problems with rail and buses is people still handing over money at booking officers and to drivers. And I hope, Paul, there's a big difference in that payment becomes much easier and it becomes user-friendly. So we move away from season tickets and we come to purses and we come to more electronic payment, always thinking about the people who can't. And it becomes a proper retail-led business rather than a supplier-led business.
I'd say choice, really. I would very much hope that going forward, people have more choice when it comes to which mode of transport they use, if they travel at all, if they work from home, to enable everybody to have the ability to travel in a way they want to when it's convenient to them, and have all of the information they need to make that decision appropriately, rather than just automatically jump in the car to go around the shop. Do they need to? So I think definitely choice would be a very positive outcome.
Okay, and that leaves me then to vote for the end of the peak. We have had AM and PM peaks for probably 100 years, I should guess, in our urban centres. we don't actually need them anymore. They've been done away with because of the lockdown, and I don't think they'll come back, and we don't want them back. And that will be a boon not just to people who actually live and work in the city centres, but also to the hinterlands, because if you think of any British urban conurbation, the queues and the wasted time start 10, 20, even 30 miles outside the centre sometimes. So goodbye peak, that would be a great outcome.
And I don't tend to give my opinions on these webinars. I just listen to others, but I'm going to dip in with one, which is going to be that I live an hour outside London on the train, and I see people that commuted in and out every day, and the downtrodden, miserable faces of commuters in their suits getting off the train on a Thursday evening in the drizzle made me think, why do people do that every day? I reckon in a year and 5 years' time, when people travel, there will be far more of a purpose, and I firmly expect to see more smiles on faces of people on trains and even in the car driving places and on buses as they travel around, because I think that actually they'll have more reason to go. And I think one of the things about home working is, while it's been far more efficient than anyone ever expected, I think I miss seeing people in 3 dimensions, and I look forward to some of those actual meetings that we talked about. Right, Carla, Jenny and Nick, thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts on the final one of these coronavirus webinars. It's been fascinating as always. We will keep picking up on this topic in an ad hoc way over the next few weeks from ITS UK, but don't forget we're fully geared up now for our virtual forum meetings, and in fact we're introducing more to do with urban authorities. We're going to have some more international webinars as well, so there's loads and loads of content to come from ITS UK, but our weekly coronavirus webinar discussions draw to a close now, but we will return again in the autumn as we see how things are panning out. But for now, all I can say is thank you ever so much for watching each week, and do keep in touch with ITS UK whenever you need anything. We'll try and be there to help for you. All the best.